Coming to you from Chicago, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government. GovLove is produced by ELGL, the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network. We engage the brightest minds in local government. I'm Dan Bolin, a local government attorney and partner, the Ansel Glink Law Firm in Chicago. For this episode, we're partnering with the American Planning Association's Planning and Law Division for Inclusionary Retail, how planning and law can safeguard small business. We're talking about how municipalities can adopt inclusionary retail policies to protect small businesses and neighborhood commercial tenants. Our guests have experience designing and implementing programs and legal safeguards to assist small businesses and promote municipal commercial corridors. They are Mikeya Griffin, Executive Director of the Rondo Community Land Trust. Mikeya has over 20 years of experience in organizational leadership, business development, affordable housing, and community development, and currently serves as the Executive Director of a Community Land Trust. Sevtsuk, Associate Professor of Urban Science and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Andres researches the public qualities of cities and has published a book, Street Commerce, Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks, focusing on how to maximize urban commercial corridors. And Julia Duranti-Martinez, Senior Program Officer for Community Research and Impact at the Local Initiative Support Corporation. Julia has experience with community land trust capacity building and currently works on community ownership and housing justice issues. Mikeya, Andres, and Julia, welcome to GovLove.
Thank you.
We're also joined by the Planning and Law Division's live webinar audience. Please share your questions with us in the chat or the Q&A or whatever we got going on down there. We'll do our best to address some of your questions before we wrap up. But first, we've got a question for you. Tell us in the chat or the Q&A, has your community already implemented programs or strategies to help safeguard inclusionary retail? Live audience, please answer this question in the Q&A, and we'll take a look at the results after our signature lightning round. That's right. It's time for our lightning round where we ask quick questions to get to know our guests, honored guests. Please tell us about your career path, starting with the day you were born through your most recent retail purchase. I assume you all work in inclusionary retail. I just paid my federal income taxes. I presume in your work, all your retail purchases are you're able to claim those as exempt, write those off. I at least very much hope. But why don't you tell us about your career paths and what led you to be here today, and maybe some interesting purchases along the way. Mikeya, why don't you start?
Wow, that's a lot. I'll try to keep it short. But the mix of affordable housing and the intersection of economic development and commercial, this work that we do as a commercial land trust is really important. And in my work, it's just, you can't just throw people in a vacuum of homeownership and then just not have a way for them to also find ways to move along their own economic continuums. And so I've done a lot of different things in commercial development, from, large site acquisition to, developing some really interesting kind of mixed for-profit, nonprofit commercial development in the Twin Cities here in St. Paul. But again, no more happier than to be doing the work that I am doing now. And I don't know if I answered all of your questions, but I also don't want to take up a lot of time.
And, you got the most important information there. Interesting to hear more about your career throughout our chat today. Andres, what have you got?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Andres Sevtsuk. I teach urban planning at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I'm probably here because of the book that I published recently called Street Commerce, Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks, which is a book that delves into the different factors that shape street-facing small businesses in cities, from the macroeconomic factors all the way down to architectural features that impact these establishments' location patterns. Aside from teaching, I also run a research group at MIT called the City Forum Lab. And in this group, we study walkable and transit-oriented, vibrant cities. We do a lot of research on this. And part of the picture is understanding what it really takes to foster and support small local businesses to locate on city streets, as they oftentimes compete with big box business and other competitive forces.
Very interesting. For the listener, if you want to tune into the video on the Planning and Law Division website of this talk, you can see Andres hold up his book. It's a very impressive, very, very good use of the camera, I'll say, to plug the book. Very well done. Julia, let's hear about your story.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Julia Duranti-Martinez. I work with LISC's National Community Research and Impact Team, and I think was invited to be part of this conversation based on a report that I put out recently called Commercial Community Ownership as a Strategy for Just Development, as well as a past report that our team worked on last year with support from the Gates Foundation that looked at equitable economic recovery strategies, prioritizing BIPOC-owned small businesses, which included a section on local policy strategies to support affordable commercial space. So I have been working on community land trust, community ownership, community-based research at LISC for the last couple of years, but previously coordinated the New York City Community Land Initiative Coalition in my role at New Economy Project, which was focused on capacity building, policy advocacy, and budget advocacy to grow the citywide movement of community land trust and cooperative development here in New York. But my background is actually in Latin America solidarity, human rights work, including accompanying communities fighting for collective land rights in Colombia, which is how I got interested in different forms of cooperative and community land stewardship and ownership. And outside of LISC, I'm the board chair of the East Harlem Barrio Community Land Trust, and also sometimes teach a class at City College for housing organizers called Organizing in the Business of Housing.
Oh, wow. Very impressive, gang. It's the end of our lightning round. Everyone has a perfect score. Congratulations. Impressive backgrounds all. Looking in the Q&A, that doesn't look like a whole lot of folks have adopted inclusionary retail policies in their communities as of yet. I suppose they're all going to learn more about how to do that here today, should that be something their communities are interested in. But I guess as to kind of like kick things off, like tell us what's the environment for small businesses out there? What are some of the challenges that they're facing today? And like what's it like out there? What are you seeing in your work? Mikeya, how about you?
Thank you. For our small businesses here in the state of Minnesota, where we are probably last as a pretty liberal state in economic development and housing for people of color, especially Black people in the state of Minnesota. And so access to lack of capital, of course, is a big issue. And then the work that we do in affordable leasing and or business ownership, brick and mortar work that we do here really is getting those grant dollars and other things that make it easier for us to be able to do our work and pair and partner with other business owners in the community. So lack of capital, and again, just the fact that it's just been systemic that small minority businesses just find it difficult here in the state. And I think we have a lot of, I come from the Rondo community, which is a historic African-American community in the city of St. Paul, which was decimated by 94. And it really had its own interdependent, regenerative, circular economy. Over 300 businesses were destroyed and over 1,000 homes were taken from that. And that continual recovery has been very interesting. There's been some booms and busts, but there really hasn't been the hold or take hold back of the community that the community wants to see. And so we've done a lot of work to hold down blocks so that our small businesses, especially African-American businesses, in particular in the Rondo community, have a space. So there's a lot of those things that happen. Along with that, we just did a study, or there was a study that was just finished called Mapping Prejudice, and the actual building that the Rondo Community Land Trust is in now also had a racial covenant on it. So you kind of pepper in all of those systemic things. I think that those are also barriers, though we are trying to negate those.
Well said. Andres, what are you seeing in your work? And maybe you can kind of introduce the idea of like, what is inclusionary retail and how it can help address some of these challenges that small businesses are facing.
Yeah, maybe to start with the latter.
Yeah.
In my definition of inclusionary retail is not necessarily the presence of a protective policy per se. I think it's more of a quality of the outcome whereby communities are able to access things they need on foot or in close proximity from where they live or work on a daily basis. And how we get there, whether it's through a legal policy or other strategies, all of these things can help achieve that outcome of inclusionarity. But I think it's really if you think about the presence of other policies that are in place, like affordable housing, inclusionary zoning policies that make sure that in some developments, a certain portion of housing units are set aside for non or below market rate access. Oftentimes, these communities end up being in expensive urban districts where they cannot afford things that are close to where they live. And therefore, there's a spatial mismatch between commercial services and the place they live. In terms of what we're seeing in the Boston area, I think it matches the story of a lot of American cities today, perhaps with some caveats. But on the one hand, Boston already well before the pandemic has been going through a rapid economic growth, which means that there's been a rapid influx of high-earning residents who come for tech and life sciences and educational jobs in the Boston region. That has put pressure on historic city environments, especially BIPOC neighborhoods in inner cities that didn't have that much interest over the past decades and all of a sudden have become sort of hotly contested territories, and gentrification is playing out really, really rapidly. I think that the pandemic has had an enormous impact. According to some surveys, the Massachusetts Area Planning Commission, the MAPC, did a survey during the pandemic in 2021, where they found that over 2/3 of businesses were struggling to pay rent, which is an enormous number. And of course, the third effect that we've been witnessing with the small businesses in particular is the continued and uncertain pathways of e-commerce rivaling brick and mortar commerce, and that hasn't resolved entirely either. All these three things, economic growth and gentrification, pandemic, and e-commerce, have put a lot of stress on small businesses. I think the way that it gets resolved oftentimes, which is unfortunate, is that we get a lot of vacancies. Increasingly, vacancies get taken up by banks and ATM machines that are willing to pay. Landlords oftentimes hold out because they're still waiting for that 10-year lease that magically will arrive, and are also kind of struggling sometimes to lower their lease because it's the very uncertain environment. And the other thing besides the sort of bankification is the foodification in the food industries. I think higher rents are oftentimes translated into fancier service, and they can sort of weather the higher rent more readily than retailers can. So we're seeing historic neighborhoods that had retail stores kind of transition over to food and lack of small-scale urban retail and more like services and food, something that I think is going on in many cities as well.
Wow, great insight. Julia, what are you seeing in your communities? And what does inclusionary retail mean to you?
I don't know that I have a ton to add to what was already said. Maybe just to emphasize that, LISC works nationally. Of course, we have 38 different local offices who each have, their own unique local challenges and opportunities. But I think, one of the resounding themes from speaking to folks, both for the commercial community land trust and community ownership strategy report and for the broader sort of equitable economic recovery strategies project that we did last year, was just the issue of commercial rents and the lack of commercial tenant protections as well in all different kinds of market context, right? Because there were some very limited forms of commercial rent forgiveness, different localities that use some of their ARPA funds and other dollars to help pay commercial rent arrears in very small grant amounts, but nowhere to my knowledge is anything like a commercial rent stabilization ordinance, which in a lot of places would be totally preempted to begin with. In a lot of places, commercial tenants don't have a lease at all. Which leaves them very vulnerable to different forms of displacement. And that's something that folks across the board really highlighted. And then just, the challenges with vacant property warehousing that Andres was speaking about, which happens in speculative markets, but then sort of on the other side of places that have experienced a lot of disinvestment and have a lot of vacant properties with really significant rehab costs. Just the cost of bringing those properties up to code is like far beyond what small business owners can afford. And so thinking then, what are some strategies to move commercial property sort of off this speculative, like boom bust, speculative disinvestment cycle and into community ownership, and there's different ways that can look, whether that's nonprofit owned real estate, whether those are community investment trusts, different shareholding or sort of crowdfunding models, along with cooperatives and community land trusts. But I think that really, as we think about, inclusionary retail strategies, I think exploring community ownership is a really critical piece of that, because as long as communities don't own or don't steward their resources in their communities, then there's always going to be a vulnerability to displacement. And of course, there's a whole host of complementary policies that, like across local, state, federal levels, could be adopted to help support that, could build nonprofit capacity, could support small businesses. With technical assistance, we can talk a lot more about all those things to help ensure that these models are successful. But fundamentally, community ownership is a really critical piece, I think.
Yeah, that's a great place to start drilling down. It sounds like inclusionary retail, a big topic, and there's some number of tools that you mentioned. What is a community land trust or a commercial land trust, and how can they help small businesses, Mikeya?
So a community land trust is a membership-owned, community-owned nonprofit organization. Typically, it is based in housing, affordable housing. It is basically ran by a tripartite board. So you have community members, leaseholders, and then there might be some public partnerships that you would want to have on your board so that you're getting the trifecta of really what does that look like for a community to come together and own. And so for us, that's, and it's all under shared equity. We do an appraisal shared equity here in our homeownership work that we do, and we have some rental programs as well. And then when we transition to including commercial, we actually really wanted to ensure that we held true 3 tenets of our homeownership work, which is really hold the land, community ownership and stewardship. And there's one more, and it really escapes me right now, but I'll get back to it. Julia, maybe you'll get there for me. But and this is all community driven. So to Andreas's point that there complete gentrification kind of happening in this community that previously been disinvested in. Community was really upset about, we are getting priced out from our lease rental. And so, and then we had elders who really needed to have matriculation from their homes to affordable rental situations. So we started our commercial land trust work in leasing, and it's affordable leasing. And so where it's $25 a square foot in our area, we lease at $7 a square foot.
Julia, well said, Mikeya. Julie, what do you have to add? And how have you implemented these kinds of land trusts in the communities you work with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, community land trusts have been around for quite some time. We're talking over 50 years at this point, and their roots go back much further to very long-standing practices of cooperation and mutual aid among BIPOC and immigrant communities. So, when we're talking about community land trusts, we're talking about like nonprofit ownership of land. The structure can be separately owned. Usually it's a permanent affordability guaranteed. And then this community governance piece through the board representation, but also typically through extensive community organizing and outreach and leadership development that can extend beyond the board of directors that governs the nonprofit organization. And so while there aren't as many resources that have been developed, not as much research on commercial applications of community land trusts, there actually are quite a few examples of community land trusts around the country that, even if they're primarily housing focused, have some commercial units as part of their portfolio, and a couple that have amassed pretty significant commercial real estate footprints. And I think increasingly, given rising commercial rents, given the impacts of the pandemic, the historic uprisings for racial justice over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of interest in exploring, in addition to community ownership of housing, community ownership of other assets, including commercial space and community space, community gardens, utilities, credit unions, all sorts of different like complementary forms of cooperative development. And I think with commercial community land trust specifically, there's a couple things that maybe differ from housing-focused CLTs that are really related to some of the particulars of commercial real estate development and the challenges of running a small business more generally. Because if you're trying to, promote small businesses actually purchasing their own commercial space that sits on community land trust land, right, that is then adding a whole additional process on top of running their actual business that is now being in charge of this commercial space, managing the property. And so that, I think, speaks to the need for ongoing support and technical assistance, and the groups that are promoting that sort of shared equity or ownership model for small businesses through a community land trust model are very intentional about providing that kind of support to the businesses that are buying into property on the land trust. I think there's quite a few others that actually use a more traditional sort of commercial lease structure. So in that case, there maybe isn't the traditional split land and structure ownership that you see with housing CLTs, because in that case, the goal is maybe to support stability for community serving or small businesses. I think one big challenge with that is how affordable you can get the commercial rents to be, just given that there's relatively limited subsidy. If subsidy for housing is extremely limited, like subsidy for commercial rents is even more so. And so oftentimes one of the goals for groups that are interested in these models is to provide affordable commercial space. But then organizations might face some difficult decisions in what sorts of commercial tenants they can prioritize the space, because they do have to have a viable business and be able to pay close to market commercial rents in a lot of cases. And so that's another lesson just from speaking with groups, is being very clear about what the goals are and the values are for the project at the beginning, and then what kinds of support to provide to commercial tenants in order to ensure that they can stay in the space and successfully steward it. And if they're not in a position to be able to buy commercial property, to be able to rent the space over time and have a successful enough business to do that. And so I think there's that one-on-one support and technical assistance piece is really critical. And then there's a couple other examples mentioned in the report I wrote and some other places that look at other forms of cooperative ownership, crowdfunding models where actually folks own a share in an income producing commercial property. And those could actually be combined with a community land trust. I know there's some groups that are really interested in that as a community wealth building strategy. And there's different dimensions to what we mean by community wealth even. So all of that, again, I think it speaks to the need to be really clear about what the goals and some of the trade-offs are for these different kinds of approaches as groups build out their plans for community ownership of commercial real estate.
And we look at, sorry.
No, yeah, I was about to say for the listener, Mikeya has been nodding vigorously the entire time Julia's talking. She's loving it. Get in there. I want to hear it.
All right, yeah, all right. Let me get in here. So, and I'm I always call myself the newish executive director of this wonderful 30-year organization that's been around. And as we transition to, again, doing both residential and commercial, the lease structure was the first foray into that because that's what the community wanted. But we are also pairing that with, we have some other folks we're pairing with an investment cooperative. We are looking at other ways, investment cooperative and or cooperatively owned business that's looking for a brick and mortar, and or we are also working on transitioning one of our legacy businesses into a cooperatively owned business. So there are so many ways that Rondo Community Land Trust is really trying to show up in the Ramsey County where we work, not just in St. Paul, but 14 other cities. And so it's been really interesting work as we move into it. And so I'm so glad to be here with everyone and hear, Julia's comments. So thank you so much.
Oh yeah, the great comments all. But Andres, I want you to get in here too. Like these tools that Julia and Mikeya are talking about. Like what kind of community assets are they like kind of promoting, and who really benefits from these kinds of policies that you've seen in your work?
I think the community land trusts and especially commercial side of those that Julia and Mikeya already talked about in their amazing work is truly an approach that basically tries to decommodify commercial space. And the problem with gentrification and the same with housing is that as space becomes commodified, it obtains all sorts of other values than the use value that is for communities, right? And then it becomes a real estate asset that people look to appreciate, and other consideration enter into its valuation and pricing. But by decommodifying it as part of land trust, is kept perpetually affordable, is truly, I think, an amazing approach. Now, in my book, I kind of make the argument that besides the sort of, and I don't really work on land trust much, and you have much better experts of this in the room here, but I try to make the argument that we have come to almost a national consensus that in housing policy, there is such a thing as inclusionary zoning, that in many cities, city governments will require that whether it's 10%, 20%, and even 30% of units in larger buildings that have more than 8 or 10 units typically will have to be rented or sold at affordable rates. We don't have anything like that in general for commercial space. So developers usually get away with doing the housing component, but not being able to deliver commercial space at affordable rates. And I think we are due a policy of this sort. Now, it's complicated. It's not easy. Housing policies are pegged to area median incomes. In retail space, it's a lot more complicated. Is it pegged to revenue? Is it pegged to profits? Is it pegged to... There's all sorts of questions about how to set this policy. But I do think that we need to figure this out. I think that kind of developing affordable housing without the affordable commercial space component will put us more and more into this issue of gentrifying the commercial space and basically leaving communities who can afford their own neighborhood amenities to spend disproportionate amounts of their income on travel by going further out and getting in a car and going to different places, and so neighborhoods not necessarily serving their interest. And so I do make an argument that sort of a policy is needed, and we need to innovate in that space to make it possible. I've also talked a little bit about cooperative ownership, which doesn't necessarily mean a land trust, but just co-op type of businesses, which, by the way, is fairly common in some European countries, but in the US, I think the northern states, the closer they get to Canada, Minnesota, and so forth, have this cooperative history that's magical and really worth building on.
Magical, love it. I do want to pick up on this thread that that you have this idea of like applying inclusionary housing policies to like the commercial applying them to commercial uses. How can they be applied that way, and are there successful examples that I know you mentioned that they're maybe not widely adopted as of quite yet, but are there any examples you point to in your book or otherwise?
Yeah, they oftentimes are kind of negotiated or discretionary. They're rarely as of right. So in Boston, for instance, the city oftentimes negotiates with developers directly and tries to make a case that certain amount of space has to go for under market rate commercial rents. And what's missing, I think, is a much more transparent and generalizable approach that this is kind of something that comes with new development, especially in hot real estate markets where it's financially feasible, that it's not going to break the buck for the developer to do this. And just like we say that 20% of housing units need to be affordable, we could say that 20% of retail space needs to be affordable. We need to figure out how that affordability definition is exactly pegged, and it may have to vary by type because it can't really be tied to revenue. It could be tied to perhaps going market rates, and we could just deduct from there because different stores have very different cost structures and revenue is not necessarily an indicator of success. But I think it is something that needs to be done. I don't know of any example in the U.S. where it's successfully rolled out as an as-of-right policy of this sort.
Well said. For our live audience, the Q&A is open, and the chat. Come on in, jump in. Please feel free to toss your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer some of your questions later on towards the end. And Andres, his book, we're gonna link to it in the show notes, and Julia's report. And I think our live audience has got some. Julie's got some materials that she shared with us. She's going to share with we are going to share with our live audience here today. But before we do that, we have more to talk about. It is the Planning and Law Division. So I do have to ask about some of the legal tools that you all use to implement these kinds of land trusts and community ownership, and kind of like tell me about the process and kind of how and the timeline in organizing what one of these land trusts or applications of community ownership that you're talking about, Mikeya.
All right, all the fun stuff. And Julia, you can jump in anytime that you'd like. But of course, you need attorneys. I mean, sorry, attorneys on the call, we need you. And we, of course, are planners. For us, we did the difficult task of doing a LIHTC, a low-income tax credit deal on top of our commercial land trust. So that was very difficult. I think in the beginning, it was really just the community, because we've been a community land trust here for over 30 years. The communities will tell us what they need, what it looks like. And it took the organization quite a few years to figure out how to transition this work and include it into their organizational structure at the same time. So I think there were some bylaw changes, some things like that had to be contemplated as we went through this work. And then, yes, and then our ground lease had to be readapted to this work. as well. Again, made more complicated by the deal and all the different streams of funding and that came along. So you need all your attorneys that, we had to change our, cash in our chips, as I always like to say, when it comes to our tax credit deals, syndication. We entered into a general partnership, and there's so many different ways that we had to adapt and use our attorney friends to do. We were lucky in this area that that both of the lots that we built on were already mixed use, so we didn't have to go through too many zoning issues. But I think there was some difficulty when it came to here. We have our Metropolitan Council, and I don't know how it works in other states, but we have every 10 years, every city has to update for, we call it their 2040, 2050 planning, their planning and use. And so there were some changes that had to be made in order to use the LIHTC dollars that we had and to get the full developments the way that we wanted them to. So we had to deal with I take it back. So we did have to deal with some zoning and use there, working with the city. And there, again, it's the league changing and making us into a commercial land trust was really more about our bylaws and how we were going to work through that.
That sounds like creative legal work. Julie in the chat says so many lawyers in her work.
So many lawyers.
Julie, what you got?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the timeline, I think that really varies quite a bit depending on like the property like the opportunities for acquisition, if you have ready access to funding, like how strong of an ecosystem there already is. And in the report, I intentionally tried to highlight a range of different kinds of contexts. But one thing that I did think was interesting about the commercial focused efforts is that by and large, they all moved pretty quickly actually to get properties first and then build out the community governance structure. And in the case of, where there's a sort of a rent to own option, like where commercial tenants can prepare to buy into the commercial structure over time. The idea is to, essentially like buy the community some time, kind of rescue properties from speculators in the meantime, and then there's a longer runway to have those sort of process conversations and consulting with attorneys about the different options to land on what the ultimate structure is going to look like, which isn't always how things happen. There's plenty of examples of community land trusts that start off organizing like a group of residents and building community power and identifying properties that might be strategic, and then sort of through organizing, like create a campaign to be able to either pressure the owner to sell, or in the case of publicly owned property, convince the city government or redevelopment authority, whoever it is, to actually transfer the property to the land trust at no cost. So it can sort of go either way, but for whatever reason, with the commercial focus CLTs, it seemed like, of the examples I saw at least, it was more in the get the land first, and then we'll have time to sort of figure this out, but otherwise we're going to miss out on critical opportunities. And I think so, especially for existing CDCs, community development corporations, or similar kinds of nonprofits that are interested in these models, that maybe have experience with community real estate development and management, it speaks to that as a possibility, for adding this as a program to existing work, or helping support the formation of a totally new entity that is maybe more closely as a way also to perhaps reconnect with some of that community organizing, base building work that a lot of, that kind of defined the community development movement's roots and history decades ago. But I think, the transactional legal support through this process of not only things that are kind of similar to like nonprofit formation, bylaws, all of that, or, for places that have co-op statutes, if people are trying to go the co-op route, like figuring that piece of things out. But then through the whole closing process for property. I mean, we, speaking about the East Harlem El Barrio CLT now, we were lucky to have pro bono legal assistance through a nonprofit legal provider in New York, which has deep expertise in CLTs, but had to bring on additional counsel with expertise in real estate finance for that aspect of things. And so in terms of, policy recommendations too for local government, one really tangible way to support this is to fund legal and technical assistance for groups that are interested in exploring these models. New York City Council funded such an initiative a few years ago. Other cities have made similar kinds of investments. That's also helping, grow the capacity of local legal providers or local development consultants to know all of the different support you need to work specifically with community land trusts and cooperatives, because often that in some places that have a long history of cooperatives or very well-established CLTs, there's already folks who have that expertise. In other places, it really needs to be kind of cultivated. And funding is a really critical part of helping do that.
It sounds like there's a role for corporate type lawyers in your work, the dirt lawyers, the real estate lawyers, the zoning lawyers, even a little bit of tax work in there too. A little bit of for everyone. But but what about the role for planners in your work? I mean, we do got planners in the call too, and what is their role, and who are some of the stakeholders that you engage throughout the process, Mikeya?
Well, we of course had to engage our city planners. And I think, especially as we move forward in our work, we gauge outside planning firms just as we're looking at exploring new developments and things like that, just ensuring that we are not running afoul of any, city zoning or planning ordinances and things like that. So, that's as much as I think that I can tell you there. I'll toss it over to one of my other colleagues here.
Julia, any thoughts?
I think that community ownership is really about having a larger community vision and community plan surrounding the stewardship of specific pieces of real estate and the structures that go on top of them. And so I think there's a real role for supporting meaningful community-led planning and visioning processes. And I think, just again, to reference like one of the examples from the report, the Anchorage Community Land Trust was able to secure a number of commercial properties first, and then later was the lead organization for a really extensive community engagement and community visioning process that then really helped set the direction for the evolution of that work and the additional programs that they wanted to add on top of this real estate development work that they were already doing. And so that was an example of how to combine those two things specifically in the context of commercial community ownership that I thought was interesting. But I think, there's so many different examples of how community land trusts and similar organizations either lead their own community processes around visions for what, alternative uses for vacant properties and how those could be used to house people permanently, or could be used for community supporting businesses, and really pushing that affirmative vision as part of their strategy for building power to eventually acquire those spaces. And so I think the things are really complementary. And then just on the, for planning folks who work for local government, being able to support these models through like planning processes that can prioritize permanent affordability, that can prioritize community ownership, especially in ways that could, to the extent that plans are binding and can help things endure past specific political administrations. I think that can be really important, because that, especially for trying to get public funding to support community land trusts and similar models, there's always that risk that once the local administration turns over, that funding won't endure or that would be cut. Political winds can change. So if there's something that can say, like, this is our 10-year, this is our 20-year plan, to at least help set that vision and set that priority, I think that's a possibility. And then, of course, trying to support the adoption of policies and funding that can channel properties to groups that can support capacity building, that can support low-cost capital for acquisition. Like, there's a whole bunch of different ways. So depending on where you sit as a planner, similar to what kind of, like, lots of different ways for lawyers to be involved, different kinds of law, similar for planners.
Andres, what do you got, Dan?
Yeah, just a quick, I guess, challenge to all the lawyers in the room. I think one of the things that makes it difficult for small, often independent urban businesses to function is that they are competing with much more organized malls and strip malls. Malls, by definition, are coordinated units where the mall owner ascribes very low rental or lease agreements to businesses that bring in a lot of people, and very high ones to those that kind of benefit from the spillover effects from the foot traffic. And by doing so, the mall owner coordinates this kind of ideal whole that maximizes profit for the whole center, and kind of different tenants of different rents. Now, main streets oftentimes have a really hard time competing with that, because it's not in the interest of a particular landowner to give any subsidy to, let's say, a community serving business like a grocery store that everybody needs. But it's not in the interest of a single landowner to give that subsidy, because everybody else will benefit off of that. And this is where I get really excited about community land trusts, because that coordination capability emerges if you were talking multiple properties in a cluster, where some can be cross-subsidized to make others work better. And that form of organization has been historically really difficult to achieve in main streets, where every landlord fights for themselves. And that coordinated approach, I think, opens up really interesting prospects for really competing on the same stage with these highly orchestrated retail clusters that are in those owned by REITs or commercial centers.
We call it our vibrant economic nodes as we move forward. How do we have, to Andreas's, I want to make sure I'm saying your name correctly, what does it take for a thriving community? And then how do we place small businesses and attract other businesses to the area that can help subsidize some of those rents and other things that we have, and or subsidize, maybe it's community benefit agreements, whatever those might be. And then can we cluster those around some affordability in the home ownership? And then, how are we uniquely placing people to either participate in a cooperative business ownership structure, or at least, well-paying jobs, and, we're hopefully near schools and other things where, again, we are creating a vibrant cluster of economic engines that can really fuel to have folks come from the outside and participate, but also people that are in that community, in that neighborhood, are actually benefiting from all of those things. So it's exciting work, and we are looking forward to seeing how we can do that in the 14 cities that we serve moving forward.
I also am seeing a question in the chat about if community land trusts or similar community-owned structures have local government funding, and if so, what is the legal authority or limitation for such funding? I'm not sure I totally understand the second part of that question, but I will start to answer the first part, which is just that there's quite a few, actually. I would say, like, to different degrees, probably most community land trusts rely on some form of public subsidy, whether that is like CBDG or home funds for housing focus groups, or state housing agency funds to local, city council funding. That's extremely common. And some of the initiatives that I was referencing earlier related to funding sort of either technical legal assistance for groups or directly funding groups to do their own for their organizing, outreach, community planning work, like not acquisition, but just that sort of organizational work. That often comes from, discretionary funds or funding that cities provide to like nonprofit organizations through their contracting process. The New York City Council has this community land trust initiative that groups fought for. That was a result of lots of advocacy. There's also a couple different California cities have similar initiatives, some of which are for, more broadly, like for permanently affordable or for community housing, and some of which are specifically focused on community land trusts. But in that case, it works the same as the kind of nonprofit award process. One big challenge for groups that rely a lot on those city contracts is just the slow pace of contract registration and actually dispersing the funds. So if you are someone who is involved in that side of things, getting groups their funding faster actually makes that's like a very tangible step that would make a huge difference in terms of the ability of groups to staff up and do the kinds of community outreach and planning that is essential to being able to acquire and steward property successfully over the long term. And then on the acquisition side, again, it works very similarly. It's to other forms of affordable housing finance or community development finance. It just happens to be a community land trust that is the recipient of whether it's loans or grants to support acquisition and development. And I think it's more just a lack of familiarity or like a lack of specific prioritization of community land trust that can be a barrier. And then the fact that for groups that are new and don't have that track record that these programs often look for, that can make it harder to compete in RFPs and other kinds of awards, to the extent that it's possible to, prioritize things like permanent affordability, to prioritize community land trusts or cooperatives or a meaningful resident leadership or community ownership component. Like those are all things that local and state governments can adopt as part of their process of awarding these funds.
A big thank you, Julia, for diving in the chat. We might have time for one more question from the chat. Do you hear any pushback for known brands over local businesses in this tool by the community as a sign of class, or by the board or government for companies with a proven model they can plug in?
Well, I think I've seen, just not even in the community land trust world, but we have seen some pushback in certain communities where they don't want chains like Starbucks and Domino's Pizzas, things like that in their community. So they have pushback in favor of locally owned. And so, in some certain areas in the state and specifically here in the Twin Cities, we do have really powerful organization groups, organizer groups that, can really get things done. So that's great. I think we have also seen where we've had chains come in through some community benefit agreements that, make that chain a little more responsive and responsible to the community that they're coming into. Most certainly when we've had conversations with our board about what does that look like as we move forward, if we have a large chain, then what does that look like if we can have them come in and be an anchor tenant, so that whether paying rent or owning a certain portion or helping develop something that allows for the affordability for other small businesses or cooperative businesses to be in a particular area. And, for us, all things are on the table.
Thank you, Mikeya. We are running short on time. I do want to give, we've got about a minute each. I want to give each of you a minute to share your final thoughts for today and answer our most difficult question. If you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode? Andres, you had your hand up.
Oh, sorry. I'll just go ahead and do the wrap up in this case. But I want to emphasize two additional points we haven't really talked about, and this goes beyond the policies and land trusts and inclusionary zoning, which is that ability to supply community serving businesses at an affordable rate to communities also depends on spatial factors that urban planning directly deals with, and the kind of spatial environments where these businesses are located. And I try to describe them in more detail in the book, but I want to highlight that, for instance, the ratio between built housing units and available commercial space directly affects affordability, because if housing units go up and commercial space stays constant, they are going to get more competition and pressure on from different possible businesses, and prices go up. It also depends on the ground floor qualities of urban street and whether certain spaces can be converted to commercial use when the need arises, and sort of city environments that actually make it possible to open up new businesses along the way. And I think it also depends on access to local main streets and subcenters and community centers, where no business center ever survives on just local area demand by folks walking to the places. And what cities can oftentimes do is help ensure that there is equitable access, either by diverting bus lines to serve local businesses and making sure that folks can get there from somewhat more remote areas, or additional city actions like helping local main streets organize car-free days, things that bring people out on foot to serve local businesses and really work with local businesses, things like diverting municipal-owned procurement funding to make sure that it stays in the community and doesn't get, to far-flung national businesses that will funnel the funding out of the community, or to sometimes even get more actively involved in helping fill vacant spaces, which is a policy that's, for instance, some cities in Europe, actually London is a good example, where city government sometimes just gets involved, says this space should not be empty, we need, let's say, a grocery store here, and they will help get that tenant in, and sometimes even step in financially to make it feasible for the tenant to put that business there. So I think there are many things that cities can do, from urban planning and urban design all the way to kind of helping generate the street life that businesses need to stay in place.
Thank you, Andres. Julia, final thoughts, and maybe some exit music if you'd like.
No, I think just final thoughts. I think it can sound daunting, perhaps, to start a community-owned real estate project. There's obviously a lot of considerations, both on the legal side and the sort of organizing side and the organizational development side. But there's also many different paths or sort of order for these things to happen in. And so I think if there's interest, the potential impact of these models is really tremendous. And so I would just encourage people to dive in and not be dissuaded or intimidated by what seems like a very challenging process, because you'll figure it out together over time, and through building those relationships with community members, with other partners, and really having community members and small businesses lead the work.
Thank you very much, Mikeya. Your final thoughts and maybe some exit music for this episode. You get to.
I'm going to give you some exit music, and we can just one love, right? Like, who doesn't love a little Bob Marley on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon? I think all the panelists have done a great job of explaining how you can get involved, what it looks like. And so I don't really have a lot more to add as a leaving statement, other than if you have the opportunity, and there are community land trusts in your area, there are over 375 across the nation. Just get embedded in cooperative ownership or cooperative and community ownership, and what that looks like. And then how you may see, as you move forward in your work, how you can bring influence to that type of work. I believe that it is the wave of the future for the United States, and it's really a way for to be equitable in our ability to serve all populations.
Well said. Thank you. We're going to add that exit music in post. That ends our episode today. thank you to our esteemed panel for coming out and talk with me. I learned a lot. Our live audience learned a lot. Our listeners at home learned a lot. You can find the APA Planning and Law Division online at planning.org. Big thanks to our Planning and Law Division Curtin Fellow, Lauren Ashley Week, for organizing this webinar, and the whole PLD team, Max, all of them. GovLove is produced by a rotating cast of ELGL volunteers. ELGL is the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network. You can reach us at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter at GovLove Podcast. Thanks for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government. Bye.
Have pity on those whose chances grow thin. There ain't no hiding place from the Father of creation.